a backlog in the province. For more on the story, we are now joined in studio by Keith Khoza. He is the Deputy Director General for Communication in the Gauteng Department of Cooperative Governance, Traditional Affairs and Human Settlements. Keith, thank you so much for joining us. And, we've seen the MEC Mashatile has called on rental property owners to submit occupation certificates. Now, this is for safety and compliance purposes. Are property owners heeding the call to submit these certificates?
Well, up until now, there has been non-compliance with many building owners, which has led to the situation that we've seen, where people stay in buildings where there is no water, no electricity, the lifts are not working, the windows are broken, and so on. In terms of compliance, for instance, nobody is allowed to occupy a building that has no water or electricity. And that's why even in the structures that were built, up until we do that, nobody can take occupation.
Now, what action will be taken with regards to the owners who fail to comply?
Well, they have to be penalized. For instance, municipalities have bylaws that govern that, which means that they need to kick in terms of the penalties which building owners would have to face, whatever penalty that is meted against them to ensure that they comply.
When you speak of penalties, what sort of penalties are you speaking of?
It could be financial penalties, or even temporarily take over of the building by government, because it's a health hazard for people that are living inside.
I was just going to say the fact that some of these owners, have you managed to find a lot of the property owners in downtown Johannesburg with regards to buildings that are illegally occupied or that have been taken over by basically people who are desperate for accommodation in the Joburg CBD?
Well, we are setting up a task team now that is going to do that audit, working with the Joburg Metro to look at all the buildings in the CBD, who owns them, do they have ownership proof, title deeds and so on, because some of the buildings have been hijacked. People are making people to pay rent for buildings they don't own. Now, because people are desperate, they go in there, pay to somebody who claims to be the owner of the building, and they're not servicing the building and so on. So it borders on criminality, actually, some of what these people are doing. So it's what we have to, the task team that is being established will look into that, work with municipalities and ensure that in an instance where something borders on criminality, the law must take its course.
Now, speaking of the criminality issue and hijacked buildings, we've seen cases where some building owners have even gone as far as the courts to try and get back their buildings from the hijackers and the people who occupy these buildings. And sometimes the law, works against the owners of the buildings. In that case, how is this going to work? Because alternate accommodation has to be found, obviously, for the people who are occupying these buildings and for the hijackers in terms of the criminal element. What is the city going to do with regards to that, and how harsh are those penalties or those charges going to be?
Well, I think when the matter is taken to the court normally looks at each case on its merit. What we know is that the law says you cannot evict people without a due process, and you also cannot evict people if there is no emergency alternative accommodation that we give to them. But the law does apply. We've had situations where people went through a legal process up to a point where an eviction order was given because there was no commitment on the side of the occupants to either comply with the agreement, the tenant agreement which they sign, or they simply there was no agreement. So the law does make provision to assist those that are either receiving end of unlawful occupation.
Now, Keith, we saw the issue of the fire last week that took place, and within minutes of that building being evacuated, where unfortunately 7 people lost their lives and some were injured and were taken to hospital, people went back to occupy that very same building, and that having been said by the government and by the fire department, saying it was a hazardous situation. What's the situation now with regards to that building? And can this issue of the fire that took place and people lost their lives be used as an example to say, this is the issue that we're dealing with, this is what we're facing, and let's work towards ensuring that it doesn't happen again? And those buildings, you mentioned a task team, have you identified buildings that have been hijacked in the CBD, and what's the first point of order with regards to the task team?
Well, there was work in progress with the city of Joburg when they came up with the rejuvenation, inner city rejuvenation program. They did some work in terms of identifying buildings that were illegally occupied, and most of them that were hijacked or illegally occupied is you find in a situation where a landlord owned a building but did not pay for services. They did not pay for water, did not pay for electricity, so much that the debt equaled the value of the building, and when the city wanted to recover the cost, they would just disappear and leave the building vacant, and people would just walk in and start staying there, so there would be no controls, nothing. But often what happens is that there are syndicates who look for such buildings and start renting them out to people. So it's a challenge that we have to look into. The task team will have a huge task ahead of itself to make sure that we deal with this decisively, because it is a danger. But also the issue that you just raised is a concern for us, that even when it is proven that a building is hazardous, people still want to go back and stay, and the argument is that where do we go? It's cold, it's winter, and we have our belongings. At least the flat I was staying in did not burn down, but often there are no windows. The buildings are stinking.
And a safety hazard in terms of
criminals staying in there, and it's a problem. The conditions are just so bad that something has to be done urgently. Now,
let's speak about the issue of the owners who are not taking care of the building, not servicing the building. Does the government have a right to take over those buildings and supply services and ensure that that owner of that property, pays for the services that government would supply, or maybe refurbish that building or take over that building or buy it from the owner?
That's why the city previously took over those buildings, because the owners disappear. Once they've run a huge bill, they don't want that obligation. They simply disappear. And the city would take that, get people to refurbish, give it to Joshco to manage, and allow people to rent under better conditions, which is one option that we're looking at in terms of taking over those buildings. We are currently under pressure to find accommodation for our people, and if there are buildings that are abandoned and people owe government, particularly the municipality, and they've disappeared, it is within their right to legally take over those buildings and use them productively.
Do we have the same problems in other parts of Gauteng?
Well, it has been, there are cases here and there, but it has been more prominent and intense around Johannesburg CBD, particularly Hillbrow, Berea, and Newville.
Now, in terms of the process of title deeds, issues that the MEC spoke of and put on the agenda is the title deeds. How far is that process?
The process is far ahead now. We have appointed a project manager that works with us in terms of expediting the title deeds issue. We have appointed about 36 conveyancing entities that are working with us. Work has started with verification in the various townships. It's progressing well. We are hopeful that by 2019 we would have dealt with the backlog of all the title deeds.
Now, Keith, very quickly, unfortunately we are running out of time, but let's speak about the issue of RDPs and how government is dealing with people who get RDPs and then end up selling them. How does that work? They get on the list, they wait for a long time, they get the RDPs, and then after some time they are then sold to other people. It's a big issue. How does government deal with that issue to ensure that the right people get RDPs and they're not able to sell that property?
Yeah, one of the things that we are doing now is we have stepped up our beneficiary education for all our beneficiaries, that if you get an RDP house, you've got a window period of 8 years. You can't sell that house, even though it's yours. You can only sell it after 8 years. Even in that instance, the state has the first right of refusal. You can sell it back to us and then we can reallocate it to the next beneficiary. And we've noticed the exercise that we're doing now of verification is showing that quite a number of houses were sold prematurely. We would need a national policy to guide in terms of what do we do, because effectively they violated the legislation in terms of doing that. Should there be penalties? What should be the penalty, and so on? Because some argue that, well, I was in a desperate financial situation because the house was mine, I had to sell it because I had to do this or that. But it's a problem because they sell these houses and go back and stay in an informal settlement.
Or do they go back onto the list? Do they find ways of getting back onto the list?
You can't.
Okay.
Because through HSS, anybody that applies, it will tell us if you have received a subsidy anywhere in the country or you own a property anywhere in the country. So it's difficult for them. That's why they end up going back to the informal settlement and stay there. Now, that's not helping us to eradicate informal settlements.
Now, very quickly, we see a lot of people migrating in and out of Gauteng, but mostly migrating into Gauteng, which obviously increases the number in terms of housing demand. People leave provinces like Limpopo or the northwest, looking for greener pastures. And Gauteng, as small as it is the economic hub of the country. In terms of that, how do we deal with that issue with regards to the housing department? Because there's a huge backlog when it comes to that, and we see informal settlements mushrooming in every corner of the province. How is the province dealing with that issue?
That's where the problem is in Gauteng. It's unprecedented. No other province has a problem similar to Gauteng. We've got an average of 200,000 people that come to Gauteng every year. Most of them have nowhere to stay. They go to informal settlements. Some of them have homes where they come from, but because they're looking for jobs, they're looking for a place to stay. Now, it makes our target of housing the people in Gauteng a difficult one because it becomes a moving target. The backlog is never decreasing. Instead, what it does, it increases, particularly when you look at things like social housing or serviced sites and so on. You know, some of these people just go to an area where there is no water, no sanitation, no electricity, stay there, and we then have to divert resources to make those areas habitable. But it's a challenge, and it's difficult because there is no law that you can use to prevent people coming through to look for jobs. It's just a question of saying, how do we deal with the crisis that we have at hand?
Keith, we'll have to leave it there for now. Unfortunately, we have run out of time. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah.
And that was Keith Khoza, the Deputy Director General for Communication in the Gauteng Department of Cooperative Governance, Traditional Affairs and Human Settlements, joining us in studio. Now, in other news,